Welcome back to Literature of the Ancient Near East. I'm your instructor, Dr. Singleton. In the second lecture of the second week, we're going to be talking about the differing types of ancient literature that you'll be reading, and of course, where those pieces of literature are found. We'll be going over connotative works, which are the more artistic pieces of literature, and the denotative works, which are the less artistic. But we'll get into that as we proceed with the lecture. For now, let's jump right in. For many, the mention of ancient literature spurs thoughts of classical plays such as Antigone or Oedipus Rex, or perhaps the epic poetry of Homer and the philosophy of Aristotle. Now, while some say that these fall within the periodization of ancient, a period sometimes categorized as prehistoric eras until AD 600, for others, like me, there's a distinction between the classical and the ancient world. The former roughly spanning 1,000 years beginning around 500 BC, essentially the time of the Greeks and the Romans. Now, within this study, ancient refers to the historical period between the advent of writing and the beginning of the classical period. But as this study is specific to the Near East and to an extent Egypt, literature under review here will not include the Persian literature, as the Persians originate outside of the Near East. Therefore, literature to be analyzed will range from the advent of writing until the close of the Neo-Babylonian period. Now, this means that the differing types of literature being assessed will include a range from Sumerian to Babylonian, and these will be broken down into 11 categories, some of which do not fall into the commonly held class of literature. Thus, while this study will look at obvious literary genres, such as the combined category of myths, epics, and tales, it will also look at hymns, poems, wisdom literature, oracles, and execration texts, along with other genres such as legal texts, treaties, inscriptions, histories, and letters. These types of ancient literature are here split into, or split between, connotative and denotative works, where connotative implies aesthetics. Of course, it should be noted that the more denotative works, like legal text and letters, very often move beyond direct sourcing and have a sense of poetic license about them, sometimes in a sense of hyperbole, as in the case of the Sumerian king list, which states, "At Eridu, Alulium became king and reigned for 28,800 years." In that same fashion, some historical texts are anything but historical, implicating something that is simply not true. For instance, the poem of the Battle of Kadesh, linked to Ramses II, where the scribe records the greatness of the king and how he routed the enemy. But he pretty much fabricates the victory. In reality, no true winner could be determined, and these types of propaganda are understood throughout the Near East. As a categorization in ancient Near Eastern literature, some works connote or imply secondary associations of differing natures, such as intellectual, cultural, or sensory associations. These ancient Near Eastern works of literature could be classified as artistic, in the sense of belles lettres. These are considered connotative partially, because of their intentionally poetic form. Here we will discuss a list of these genres and what separates them from other Near Eastern genres. Although the three genres of myth, epic, and tale are separate in their meanings, they are each an example of ancient narrative, the telling of a story. Although narratives, these differentiate from each other in style, namely the stylistic differences of categories that we in the Western world have come to call myth, epic, and tale. Now, it's vital to acknowledge that these differentiations are modern perceptions placed upon ancient writings, and many times the definitions of these terms are dependent upon the modern author of those definitions. Still, there is an overall sense of meaning within these respective literary terms. Concerning historiography, many, if not most, of these narratives were subjectively believed to be true by the original audiences, as evidenced by the rituals sometimes associated with them that affected the way adherents lived. Now, while there are fictional elements to all the stories, none are fictional in the sense that they have no basis in reality. Instead, these narratives can be understood as analogical explanations of reality, or what the people believed to have occurred that brought about geographical, uh, natural, societal, and even historical reality. To the first, a myth is understood primarily by its function, specifically the ordering and explaining of the present world. Thus, the myth explains the religious beliefs of a people, very often serving two purposes: to explain where a people have come from and to explain how to maintain the status quo. As myths connect a people to their past, they act as a channel for social reproduction, transferring societal norms to the next generation and creating models to live by. As is exemplified within the myth, violations of these social norms have the possibility of destroying the civilization, and surely no individual within a society wishes to be the one to cause such harm. Although not always the case, many myths explain the deeds of a deity or hero, who is sometimes a demigod, and how that deity or hero has instituted a universal change in how the world or society works, revealing the origin of specific features in the social or natural world. Examples of this include creation myths such as Enuma Elish, which describes the cosmic struggle between chaos and order that's renewed yearly. This cyclical struggle is also seen in what has been termed the Baal cycle. Here, El, the Canaanite chief god, has decided to elevate his son Yam to the position of divine regent. Unfortunately, as the personified sea, the watery chaos that is Yam threatened order in the world. Thus, Baal, the giver of rain and life, corrects the issue. As is the case in Enuma Elish, the threat of chaos and death is never fully mitigated. The deity or hero needs to correct the issue cyclically, that is, from year to year. Now, it's significant that to many, the annual festivals and traditions surrounding mitigation rituals actually instituted change in the real world. Myth truly believed held more importance than actual fact, belief having a practical significance and affecting how people live. Although there's overlap, the second type of literature to be researched within this study is that of the epic. Unfortunately, today any number of things are referred to as epic, including movies, songs, and even elections. But when one speaks of epic literature, one is speaking of the heroic ages, when peaceful heroes achieve glory, often in combat. Very often, the hero or heroic event is foundational to how a culture understands the past. The epic embraces important historical or cosmic events, such as the fall of Troy, the founding of Rome, and so forth. In fact, Homer's Iliad has remained the epitome of the classic epic since Aristotle. The epic often contains an extensive cast of characters and is usually found in a rather long form, recording great achievements and including immense suffering. This genre is sometimes understood to be a type of heroic poetry, sometimes reinforced with supernatural powers, as in the case of Achilles. And often these works contain national themes. Of course, the great length, nationalism, and awe inspiring heroism is seen in many epics, but not all. Perhaps a standard ancient Near Eastern epic is that of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains the key element of epic literature, heroism. In the story, the famed Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, begins as a tyrant whose own people cry to the gods against him. The hero eventually saves his people from a monster, but loses his best friend in the process. The remainder of the story is the grief stricken Gilgamesh searching for, but failing to find, immortal life. Interestingly, there are no epics in ancient Egyptian literature. Instead, in Egypt, there's an abundance of tales. Similarly to the epic, the tale as a literary genre is imaginative and artistic in nature. Contrary to the epic, the tale is characteristically short. In Russian criticism, the tale, although not always set in a magical or fairy world, is fantastical or fictional. But in the case of ancient Near Eastern tales, this is uncertain. For example, the tale of Wen Amun, Wenamun, is understood to be either a fictional story of an Egyptian diplomat in Byblos or an actual report from that diplomat. Similar tales, such as the Tale of Sanui, are written autobiographically, which is understood to be a very early literary genre in Egypt. And much of the story's facts appear quite historical. But the story also carries aspects of fictional writing. The real question is not whether the tale is a story of fiction, but whether the original audience understood it to be fictional. And that remains uncertain. Rather than an emphasis upon historicity, the tale appears to emphasize aspects of humanity. Hymns are also found throughout the Near East, including Sumerian, Akkadian, and Egyptian contexts from around the 3rd millennium BC. This genre of literature is primarily a type of direct address to a deity, essentially comprised as prayers, which include invocations and petitions, and to some extent, complaints, thanks, praise, and persuasion. Contrary to simple prayers, hymns appear designed to be sang with an instrumental accompaniment. These hymns that were characterized by effusive praise were sometimes also directed at human sovereigns, cities, or temples. In this sense, hymns were differentiated from prayers in that the petition was the natural focal point of the prayer, but petition within a hymn was secondary to praise. Within modern scholarship, ancient Near Eastern hymns appear to function as general supplications or focused narrowly and dominated by praises and adorations. From the earliest of sources, hymns were a part of temple ritual, and those who sang the hymns were an important aspect of temple personnel. Although present in the Levant, most of the extant hymns come from Mesopotamia, from Sumerian and Babylonian sources, and from Egypt. In these, hymns are the common themes of the lineage of the gods, a city or temple's patron deity, abilities and powers of the gods, or a deity's preeminent position within the world. Much of ancient Near Eastern writing could be said to be poetic, understanding that the most common use of the word poem is simply a composition in verse. Examples of this in the ancient Near East include the Egyptian Tale of Sanui or the Akkadian Ludlu Bel Nemeki, which obviously these are cross genres. And this concept carries into the Greek period as well, with Homer and Hesiod writing in verse, uh, in verse. Sorry. While there's such a thing as the love poem in the ancient Near East, poetry here is understood primarily to be the poetic form. And I don't think we're going to be talking about love poems at all, but I don't remember offhand. This poetic form is that composition written in verse, which is certain technical conventions utilized by the author to regulate the composition, often line by line, often by line length and making of that line in or the making of that line a part of the form of expression. Excuse me. Unfortunately, much of what today is considered poetic eludes the modern reader when reading ancient poetry, such as meter, rhythm, or perhaps even rhyme, aspects of poetry that cannot be understood when one cannot be sure of the pronunciation of the language, particularly a dead language. With that said, other aspects of poetic devices are well understood, such as the use of similes or metaphors, including where Zeus is referred to as the cloud gatherer, Baal as the cloud rider, and Adad as the establisher of clouds. Parallelism is perhaps the most easily detectable poetic device within ancient Near Eastern literature. For example, within the Baal cycle, aloud they summon the assembly of the deities. They invite the distant ones. The assembly of El they summon. Other poetic features not associated with sound come in the form of colorful and unusual language, rhetorical figures, special syntax, and alliteration. Wisdom or didactic literature is often seen in instructions, dialogues, satire, proverbs, and fables. These teachings are usually manifested by persuasive expressions and are generally understood to be collections of treasured lore, whether written or formulated by the author. Discovering a definition for wisdom literature proves difficult. But as a genre, wisdom literature incorporates expressions of reliance on human experience in order to cope with the uncertainties of life. Sociologically, wisdom literature originates in a range of venues, from village and family life to courts and royal circles. In essence, the literary works largely supported stability and order in social life, that is, favoring the keeping of the status quo. And as such, these instructions acted as primary sources for social reproductive beliefs. As with most ancient literature, terminology and definitions are dependent upon the scholar. For classicists, the term oracle may mean something different than the word prophecy, but these are used here interchangeably. Thus, prophecy, or oracle, is understood as alleged divine messages transmitted through human form. In this regard, a prophet is one who speaks the words of a deity, that is, who is the mouthpiece of that deity. The prophecy itself is the conclusion to a two-part process. First, the prophet participates in some sort of cognitive experience, such as a vision, an audition, a combination of the two, a dream, or so forth. Second, having already understood the commission to deliver the revelation, the prophet does so in either a verbal form, written or oral, or in a nonverbal yet communicative act, such as through symbolism or sign actions. Unfortunately for modern scholars, prophecy in the ancient Near East is known solely through differing written sources that have basically been preserved accidentally, and therefore scholars only know what those sources allow them to know. Through the Mari text and Jeremiah 36, it's known that oral prophecies eventually gave way to written prophecies, where prophets dictated what was to be written to scribes. But what was prophesied before these changes had taken place is lost to mankind, except where written sources explain them. The execration texts are Egyptian texts based on execration rituals. magical actions designed to thwart or eradicate enemies. These rites had taken place in Egypt since as early as the Old Kingdom and had carried on at least until the Roman period. Often found on ceramic bowls or figurines, these texts contain formulaic inscriptions listing whatever or whomever was considered uh, um, inimical, harmful, and then ritualistically smashed. By destroying the object, the named would be magically cursed, and through repetition, the enemies of Egypt were repeatedly damned. Over 1,000 execration deposits have been discovered throughout Egypt. The most elaborate execration texts come from the Middle Kingdom, and the names of both peoples and places demonstrate a rather accurate geographical knowledge, likely having been based upon reports of those who had traveled abroad. Surviving fragments appear to have been a part of the official state-sponsored magic utilized by the governing class to curse enemies of the state. Finally, works of denotation or denotative works are texts considered to be non-literary by some. Within the ancient Near East, these denotative works would include legal and administrative texts, as well as scientific texts. These texts would have been considered reference works, that is, texts that could be referred back to when the moment demands. For the purpose of this study, these denotative works will include legal texts, treaties, inscriptions, historical texts, and letters found throughout the ancient Near East and Egypt. For the most part, texts from the ancient Near East were discovered through archaeological investigation. Examples of finds come from sites such as Tel Mardik, ancient Ebla. There, more than 1,700 tablets and more than 4,800 fragments were discovered, along with many thousands of small chips of tablets. Other sites, such as Nippur in Mesopotamia, have revealed tens of thousands of tablets held at the University of Pennsylvania's Penn Museum, along with those discovered at Bila, Malayan, and Farah. In all, it's suggested that more than 600,000 clay tablets and hundreds of other inscriptions on other materials are being held in museums around the world. And it's likely that only a small fraction of these have yet to be thoroughly studied. By necessity, even with these large numbers, this means that scholars have very little to work with. The literature that's currently being studied may at some point prove to be the minority report of these documents. Older or more complete text may yet be discovered. Additionally, the translation of text may be updated as a more clear understanding of ancient languages is developed. For example, in the Baal cycle, where previous scholars assumed sexually explicit material where there is none. The study of ancient literature must be then a continual study. Well, that was kind of a quick little rundown, especially in light of the last lecture, of what you have in store for you this semester. And our final introductory lecture, we'll talk about how to actually interpret them. As always, feel free to reach out to me with any comments or questions.